Okay, I zoom these in, and I get when it works. Like the computer got shut off, but Dr. Butters had showed me how to turn the computer back on. But if the recording comes out, and if you're going to be gone for some reason, send me an email, and I can send you the link to the recording. I know that the Dr. Butters recordings are now up. The most recent ones rendered, whatever rendering does. So if you can get on the YouTube video and see the old ones if if there was something that you wanted to go over again or whatever. Jacob Rice wanted me to announce that there's going to be a return of the Praxis events. Everybody know what Praxis is? It's sort of the sort of economics club of some sense. Anyway, to start things off, they're going to have a membership meeting this Thursday, with the 9th, which is tomorrow, at 7 p.m. here, Lane 124. So if you are interested at all in Praxis, or at least finding out what they're doing this semester, tomorrow night, 7 o'clock in here. And I am going to take roll today. Okay, Joshua, Harrison, Jean-Luc, Joseph Bentley, Mark Bergeron, okay. Nathaniel Bly, okay. Stephen, Drew, Julius, Joseph Hissam, Joseph, going once, twice, okay. Luke's over there, Rachel, Jackson, Tom, McFay, there you are. Yeah, so you got in contact with did you get in contact with the guy? Okay. Nicholas Lowley, Canella, True, which I'm not sure is right, but that's what I call you. So, John Ortman, Tavio, Alex, Schnell, and the one time that I say Alex instead of Alexander, he's not here. Caroline Shelton, okay. Sarah, Kevin, and Grace, Elaine, and Brianna. Okay. All right. In your 415 folder, there's a PDF of arrows and possibility theorem, another discussion of that. It's from public finance text, and it calls the different conditions a little bit different. Like if you look at arrows and possibility theorems, a lot of the articles might have a slightly different terminology, but for all saying the same thing. So the real idea then is, Arrow is looking at, can you figure out a way that there's a social choice rule that looks like what we would expect from an individual? Now, is there a utility function that you guys all have? We assume that they have certain conditions. Could we have a social choice thing that mimics that? I'm going to be doing the round table for Victor Davis Hanson's talk today, and I guess I don't want to have a lot of chalk all over myself when I do that, so I'm going to use this today. So we said that the first assumption that we talked about, right? These are the assumptions, or we'll call them conditions. Okay. what are these conditions that are reasonable qualities that we think a social choice rule might have? And we said that the first thing that we talked about is that it ought to be complete and it ought to be transitive. That is, I shouldn't say, oh, you know, Luke is just too crazy in his way of thinking. We can't count him in the social welfare function. Okay, everybody's preferences ought to be able to be included, and it ought to be transitive in that if X is preferred or equal to Y, and Y is preferred or equal to Z, then X ought to be preferred or equal to Z. So it ought to be complete and transitive. Second thing is oh, excuse me. Let's go back to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Okay? Take that, reverse it. What do I mean by complete? What I meant by complete is I can pick between any two states of the world, right? Okay? So complete means I can pick between any two states of the world. I can't say, now you could say you're indifferent between them, right? I could say state of the world A is indifferent to state of the world B, but I can't just say, can't figure out what we're going to do with this state of the world, right? So it ought to be complete. What I was just talking about is the idea of universal domain. And that's where universal domain is where I should pick up everybody's preferences. It's also called unrestricted domain. So, in fact, why don't we, if I'm asking you on the mid, what do you think is going to happen, right? I put the old midterms on there, right? And you can see on the old midterms that what's an obvious thing for me to ask for you to tell me what the conditions for that arrow's conditions are, or qualities are. So let's just, if it'll be easier, I guess, if we just call it unrestricted domain for our purposes. So when I'm grading your exam, which I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to be grading 70 Econ 105 essay exams, and I'm going to be grading 26 of your essay exams. Let's just stick to, we'll stick to unrestricted domain. But then, so complete, I can pick between any two states of the world, either A is preferred to B or A is equal to B. And then it's transitive. The thing out of X greater than or equal to Y, Y greater than or equal to Z, X greater than or equal to Z. And then unrestricted domain means I should be able to pick up everybody's preferences. Why that's going to be important is it turns out that if you do majority rule and you have preferences, we're going to do this next time, but if preferences are single peaked, if that's true, then majority rule works. Okay, so that sort of violates the idea that if you don't have single peak preferences, then majority rule isn't going to work. Okay. Third thing is sort of the obvious, that it ought to be Pareto consistent. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means that consistent, it ought to pick Pareto optimal states of the world. Whatever it chooses, we'd like it to be at a Pareto optimal state. Okay? If the social welfare function, if it's not a Pareto optimal state, if it's picking something that's not a Pareto optimal state, then we could make somebody better off, no one else worse off. That wouldn't be something that we'd want to do that. So if we think about this, it's basically that if all members choose A over B, then the social welfare function should choose A over B. Well, before I forget, I also put my handwritten lecture notes in that subfolder in this section. So it'll say notes there. So everything that we're doing here, if you didn't quite pick it up or whatever, you can look at the old lecture notes. And again, it's also in the textbook, the social welfare function. That section of social welfare, chapter 3, is in the textbook folder. All right. Then you have what we call independence. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. And what does that mean? I mean that a choice between two states of the world, A or B, okay? That is, looking at how does the social welfare choose between A and B? It ought to be independent of A or B over the point C, or the state of the world C. Independent of the choice of A or B over the state C. So, why would you have that in there? And the reason is because you could have strategic voting otherwise. Okay, and let me just give you a little example here. What this does is precludes, do this thing here. Never happens with chalk, right? It's not like the chalk stops writing. You might run out of chalk, but what did I say? Okay, let's say points were awarded to the football teams, and it picked the national championship. And you guys are so young you don't remember this, but if it used to be that the way the national championship was decided wasn't by a football, these teams play, and and then you go to the championship game. That's how you do it now. But it used to be that they surveyed the AP and then the UPI, the Associated Press, and the United Press International. They had a bunch of writers that covered football, and they would rank the teams. And the way they ranked them was you got 10 points if you were the top pick, 9 if you were the second, 8, done, until you pick the top 10 teams. So if you were an AP writer, then you could pick the top 10 teams and you'd rank them, okay? Or if you're a UPI, you'd do that. And then what happens is the team with the most points is the national champion. And I think this ended sometime in the 1990s. I think that's how it worked. Okay, so now let's say you want University of Michigan. That's your favorite team. That's the team that you want. Okay, so you want U of M, right? That's your top pick. But you think Alabama is going to be really close to, in terms of points, to the University of Michigan, right? So basically, Alabama, it's going to be close, okay? So you want to make sure that U of M wins. Well, you're not going to rank Alabama second, right? You're going to rank Boise State second, right? You may not rank Alabama at all, but let's say you make Alabama, 10th, to what? To make it more likely that U of M wins. So that you can see that this if you have the purpose of this independence of irrelevant alternatives is to say your choice between A and B is independent of what's going over here with something C, because if it's not, then you can strategically vote, or you can misreveal your preferences in order to get the one that you really want most likely to occur. And so the idea is we want people to reveal their preferences. Anyway, that's this quality is probably the least intuitive of the qualities, but again, why is independence of irrelevant alternatives there? It's to make it so that you don't have an incentive to misreveal your preference or to undertake strategic voting. And then the last thing is that it ought to be non-dictatorial. Ought to be non-dictatorial. And what does that mean? It shouldn't be that the social welfare function is Dr. Wolfram decides. Okay, so that it can't be that one person decides for all of us how it works. Okay, now what did Arrow figure out? Arrow showed any social welfare function has the first four characteristics. The only one that works is a dictator. So that you can't have a social welfare. Arrow's impossibility theorem is to show that any social welfare function that has the first four characteristics, which seem reasonable, is going to be the dictator. That's the only one that satisfies that. So that sort of threw a bit of a monkey wrench in things, and it really cast a doubt over: can you figure out what the social good is? Can you figure out what the will of the people is? Can we say this is what's good for America, right? Or this is what's good for Hillsdale College students, or this is what's good for the family? So Arrow's impossibility theorem just basically says if whatever your social welfare function looks like, if it has these reasonable characteristics that you think are similar to what an individual would have, it's not going to work. So there was as you might expect, there was a bunch of reaction to that, to this Arrow's impossibility theorem, and there were sort of two types of reaction, right? Buchanan and others, right? Buchanan and others basically said, you know what? This is sort of silly to begin with. You can't personify society, right? This is, we shouldn't have expected anything like that. You really can't personify society. So basically, why do we care in the sense that about Arrow's impossibilities theorem? Because it doesn't make sense to have a social welfare function to start with. It doesn't make sense to say, America prefers this over that, right? You just can't personify groups. Then a second reaction was, what happens if, so we might just say reaction number one, reaction number two, what happens if you drop or modify the assumptions or the characteristics? Right? What if you drop or modify the characteristics? You could drop completeness. That is, we could just say, you know what, there's going to be some states of the world that we just can't figure out what to do with it, right? I can't tell you anything about there's a certain state of the world that we just can't figure out what to do with it. And so we could we could drop completeness and just say, okay, basically there's just going to be some states of the world I can't figure out what to do with it. Some states of the world I can't figure out. And just hope that that doesn't happen very often, right? It might be that, yeah, occasionally that might be a problem, or maybe it never really turns out to be a problem, you know. But you know, so you know, is completeness a big thing to worry about? Second thing, you could drop transitivity. You say, you know what? It's just we're just going to say we're not going to worry about the social welfare function being transitive, and just hope that, you know, there might be some cases where it doesn't occur. We're going to look at majority rule next, and it turns out that majority rule can be intransitive. It can be cyclical. And so the order in which you take the vote can make a difference. Maybe that doesn't happen very often. Maybe we just don't. Maybe just don't need to worry about that. You can do what's called quasi-transitivity. And what quasi-transitivity is that x bigger than y bigger than z, then x bigger than z, right? So you drop off the equal to thing. So it's if you're not going to worry about x indifferent to y, right? We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say x bigger than y bigger than z, x is bigger than z, and it turns out that if you do that, then you get an oligarchy. You know, rather than a dictator being the only situation, an oligarchy chooses. And what does that mean? It means like a group of individuals, rather than just a single individual, rather than just being a dictator. A group of individuals would determine what the choice is. We can even further. I'm not going to worry about that. But there's a thing called acyclical, which says that x preferred to y preferred to z, then not z preferred to x. And it turns out that you get what's called a collegium that can make a determination, but we're not going to worry about that. You could drop unrestricted domain. And you could drop unrestricted domain, and some people's preferences just are too odd to count. And it turns out, and again, we're going to focus on this, that if you require single peak preferences, it turns out majority vote can work. It will be transitive. Now, you know, so you can say, let's just assume that there's not very many issues where people's preferences don't have single peakness, and we're just going to say, okay, there's going to be some times where this thing's not going to work, but the vast majority of times, this particular rule is going to end up having these characteristics that Arrow wanted to talk about. Again, we'll look more about this when we talk about Black's theorem. You could drop this independence of irrelevant alternatives so that your choice between A and B is affected by your choice between A and C. If you drop the independence of irrelevant alternatives. And then it turns out any point scoring rule where I give 10 points to my first choice, or I may give, we'll look at different ways of assigning points. You could have the, I don't know if you followed in New York City, they did rank order voting for the mayoral election and the Democratic primary. So it turns out if you drop this, then any scoring rule works. And the problem with that is different scoring rules can give you different answers. And of course, what that means is whoever picks the scoring rule can affect what the answer turns out to be, whatever whatever society prefers. So whoever can set the agenda can determine what the answer is if you drop independence of irrelevant alternatives. Now, just a last point that's less well known is arrows and possibility theorem only works if there's the number of voters is finite. Okay? If you have an infinite number of voters, it turns out arrows and possibility theorem doesn't hold. And again, there's all sorts of papers that were written in response to arrows and possibility theorem. Peter Fishburne figured this out, and I have an article that talks in your folder that talks about this. But in 1970, Peter Fishburne, he found out that arrows theorem only holds if the number of voters is finite. And, you know, that's just sort of a technical issue in that how often you're going to have an infinite number of voters, okay? But you'll notice that if you, if you go on and you're working on your PhD, you're going to find out that there's all sorts of articles and things that are written about really technical points that probably don't exist in the real world anyway. But nonetheless, you could, if you were talking, you go on to graduate school and you're talking to somebody and they're, talking about, you say, you know what, did you know that arrows and possibility theorem doesn't hold if the number of voters is infinite? And then they'll go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And you'll say, oh, you should read Peter Fishburne's 1970 paper. And so anyway, all right. Okay. As I mentioned, I did. Basically, I took my handwritten notes because a number of a few semesters ago, we couldn't show up for class and da-da-da-da. So anyway, I just did a PDF of that. So if you want to, want to look at your notes in more detail, you can do that. Okay. Any questions on errors and possibility theorem? Yeah.
Could you explain why the fifth point to the non-dictatorial can't exist with the first four? Like, what's the connection?
We'd have to go through the whole thing on arrows and possibility theorem, which is a very, very dense and detailed way that he ended up with it. So I think, just the point that I want you guys to know is arrows and possibility theorem's out there and says, hey, any social welfare function that's got these characteristics to it, the first four is going to be dictatorial. It's the only one that works. And then, like I said, if you make it quasi-transitivity, then you can get an oligarchy determines. So that's just sort of the point here. It's beyond what we could do in one lecture to go through and prove arrows and possibility theorem. However, if you want, there's a number of articles that you can see that go through arrows and possibility theorem. And then there was a bunch of articles that tried to show here's some flaws in arrows and possibility theorem. Again, if you find that very interesting, you can you could do your paper on something like that. Anything else? All right. So you see the point of it is just that it sort of threw a monkey wrench into is there a way to find the preferences of the group as a whole? Yeah. 1950.
And then completeness versus unrestricted domain. Unrestricted domain is everyone's counted, whereas completeness is we take into account all states of the world.
Correct. Completeness says I got to be able to compare all states of the world. Unrestricted domain just means that everybody's preferences are going to be there. Which, and again, in a moment we're going to do here majority rule, and it's going to turn out that majority rule has some problems to it. But if people's preferences are single peak, then it all works out okay. And so that would say I want to be able to, if I can include if your all preferences are single peak, we're good to go. But if somebody doesn't have single peak, and we'll talk in a moment here what we mean by single peakedness. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what sort of choices we might have if you have majority rule. So we're going to vote on it somehow. And what are different ways that you could do it? The first one we're going to talk about is Vixel. And he wrote a paper in 1898. Actually, he's sort of an interesting character if you want to look up Knut Vixel and a bit. And he had a paper called A New Principle of Just Taxation. And again, this is in the notes, but it's also in the textbook chapter 3, New Principle of Just Taxation. So what Vixel did is he says, okay, rather than here's what I want to do. I want to make the voting, however we're going to do it, I want to make it look as much like voluntary exchange like we have in the private sector as possible. What do we know about voluntary exchange? How do markets work? I can't force you to buy my product. You can't force me to sell your product. I can't force you to buy my labor. You can't force me to buy my labor. Everything that happens in a market process is a voluntary exchange, which means that it's unanimous. Okay? We don't have, you forced me to buy this product. I really didn't want to buy it. So that doesn't happen in a market system. So he's trying to make the government system, particularly with regard to how much we're going to produce of a good and how we're going to pay for it, he wants to make that look like the private sector. And so what he's got two pieces to that. And the first piece is that we're going to vote on tax and expenditure at the same time. That is, notice that there's a bill going through that President Biden is trying to have now it's the $3.5 trillion, individual infrastructure or something like that, okay? You vote on that bill, and then separately, you'd vote on how we're going to pay for it, right? You don't often vote on the taxes and the expenditure at the same time. So that what he suggests is that in order to make it so that it's less likely that the majority can impose their will on the minority, what we're going to do is we're going to vote on the expenditures and the taxes at the same time. So if we're going to, an example in Michigan is the motor carrier fuel tax, what you would call the gasoline tax, but it's technically the motor carrier fuel tax. The motor carrier fuel tax says, here's what the tax is, so many cents per gallon, and what do you do with it? It goes into the transportation fund. So it's got to be used for highway repair, et cetera. So there's a connection then, and what do we call that? We call it earmarked taxes. If you're talking about from ECON 402 from public finance, those are earmarked taxes where you say, here's what the tax is going to be, and here's what we're going to spend the money on. So Vixel said, we're going to vote on tax expenditure at the same time, and we want unanimous vote. Okay? So that everybody is going to say, yeah, I prefer this tax expenditure combination. So he wants to sort of mimic what's going on in the private sector, is that we're going to propose a majority rule. So no one is forced to pay for the amount of a good that they don't want. Right? Notice that if it's unanimous to do this, that means it's going to be a Pareto efficient thing to do, right? So if it's unanimous, it's going to be Pareto efficient. Everybody votes on it. Now, notice that there's going to be some transactions cost to this, right? Let's say we're voting on this infrastructure bill, and let's say we do it within the Congress. Then what's going to happen is that you're going to have to keep, you put out this bill, here's the tax, here's the expenditure, everybody agree on it? Somebody says, no, I'm from Arizona and I don't think that my constituency is going to like this. You got to make so that Arizona doesn't have to pay, Arizonians, I don't know, is that anybody from Arizona? Is that what you call them? I don't know. People from Arizona don't have to, they don't have to pay as many taxes as people from Wisconsin, okay? Or if you were doing it where it were the state of Michigan and everybody's voting on it, all the individuals are voting on it, well, then what I got 10 million people that are saying, okay, here's how much I have to pay, here's how much we're going to spend on this good. Well, you can see that there's going to be high transactions cost to that, right? Yeah. Well, you're agreeing to pay the taxes. See, here's the thing I'm going to say. Here's how much taxes you're going to pay. Here's the amount that we're going to spend. And you say, yeah, I'm good with that. Okay. If you say no, then okay, we're going to have to futz around and change what it's going to look like. Okay. So you can see that. To get that right, if if the group are sufficient, like all these things, right? If the group's sufficiently small, what did we have before? If the group are sufficiently small, we may know other people's preferences, right? Here, if the group's sufficiently small, then it may be that everybody says, yeah, I'm happy with that. But once the group gets to any size, then you got to have a problem about how do I change the tax part? How do I change, here's the differences in your tax burden, or do I change, here's how much we're going to spend on the public good, or do I have to change them both? You can see that, that realistically, that would be hard to do. A second thing is, it's going to be what? It's going to be subject to strategy. Just like when we were talking about point voting system, if you didn't have independence of irrelevant alternatives, ooh, there's a nice one. Right? It's going to be subject to strategy. And why is that? Because you can veto it, right? Any individual has veto power. And so what do they want to do? They're going to want to capture most of the benefit. Right? So if there were 10 of us voting and 9 of us really want it, okay, and we're all happy here, and you want it too, but you go, you know what? I'm voting no unless you reduce my taxes. And you guys all go, okay, you know, I'm still going to get some benefit if now I'm going to bear some of the other person's taxes. So everybody's got veto power. That means everybody has an incentive to use that veto power in order to capture the benefit. So that obviously would be a problem in trying to use this VIXL majority rule situation. So, and VIXL even recognized that in that, so VIXL said, well, you know, I know it's going to be difficult to make it unanimity, so VIXL said, okay, we're going to use, how about a supermajority? Majority, okay? A supermajority, so that maybe we have a 90% or 80%, okay? So let's say if you had 90%, for example, no one person can veto, right? So you lessen this strategic voting part by making it so that it's a supermajority. So VIXL noted that, so he suggested that it be a supermajority of, let's say, 90%, and that would best mimic what the market system does. And again, like I said, you do see some instances of this where you have earmarked taxes. So, you know, should we raise the gasoline tax to fix the damn roads? I don't know if you were here when Governor Whitmer was running for governor. That was her theme, fix the damn roads. If you've driven on my road, you can say, haven't done it yet, Governor, but that's okay. But the point is here is that there, you know, earmarked taxes might have some of this characteristic to this. Now, interestingly, this had an influence on Buchanan. This idea of and there's even articles. Then I think I have one of the articles I put in your folder. There's even articles written on how much VIXL influenced Buchanan's view of things. But so the real important piece of the influence on Buchanan was that, notice the transactions costs and what he calls the external cost. That is, of any decision, of any majority rule, vote. Okay? So that he said, you know what, this is what, you know, looking at this, I said, okay, there's going to be two issues here. What is VIXL trying to do? VIXL's trying to eliminate or or reduce as much as possible the ability of the majority to impose its will on the minority. Impose the will on the minority. And that part is what Buchanan calls the external cost. That is, the majority imposes a cost on you, right? We're going to make it. We're going to produce a good. The state of Michigan is going to produce a good that you don't want at all, but we're going to impose a tax on you. Okay, so our decision is doing what? This is what they call the external cost. That is, there's some cost to the minority that's imposed by the majority. So he got the big picture of Vixel, that Vixel's trying to do what? To minimize this other part, right? Vixel's trying to make it so that the majority doesn't impose its will on the minority. Everybody's going to say, yeah, I'm good with this, okay? But Vixel's saying, hey, I noticed that if we do this, then there's going to be transactions cost to come into the right answer. And so what Buchanan said, hey, that's an interesting thing to think about. And so what Buchanan and Gordon Tullock in their book Calculus of Consent that we referred to before when we were talking about the Public Choice Hall of Fame, right? In the Calculus of Consent, what does Buchanan and Tullock say? They say, you know what? There's probably some optimal majority. Right? That is, rather than only minimizing the external cost, rather than just minimizing the external cost that Vixel wants to do, let's notice that there's transactions costs that Vixel's noticed, and there's external costs. And what we ought to do is we ought to minimize the sum of those two. So just quickly, and we'll go over this more next time, is that if we did something like this, and we had, this is the percent of the majority that you need. If you have 0%, what does this say? This is basically a dictator, right? And over here, if it's 100%, this is going to be unanimous. And the thing to notice is that the external cost is going to be 0 down here, right? If we're 100% unanimous, nobody's got something imposed up on the majority. And that external cost probably looks something like this. That is, the external cost is going down as we move from the dictator to the majority. On the other hand, what's going on is transactions cost is 0 if Dr. Wolfram gets to decide. Okay? But as we go towards unanimity, right, we get higher and higher transactions costs. And so the idea is there's going to be some, should have made that, right? There's going to be some total cost, and there's going to be some point where that's at its minimum. And let's say it's, 65% or something like that. So we'll go into this again in more detail on Friday. But you go ahead and take a look at this discussion both in the notes and in the textbook part. And what we'll see is that there's some. The point is that there's some percentage of majority that makes us that it minimizes the two costs. All right. Okay. We'll see you all on Friday. And again, if there's some reason that you can't be at a class, you're traveling for something, football or whatever, just send me an email and I'll send you the link to the Zoom lecture. And I think the lectures will be coming up more frequently in the afternoon in terms of the recording, that you have the link to the YouTube.